Well, hello everybody and welcome to this Nehemiah Bible study. We're working through the book of Nehemiah, one chapter at a time. You can of course go back and see all of the previous episodes that have brought us up to this point. But today we're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 11. We're going to read some of the verses and then delve into the key themes. And we really hope that this enriches your personal reading and helps you to hear more from God as you read his word for yourself. But Nehemiah chapter 11, let's go ahead and read the opening verses here. Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Now some Israelites, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants lived in the towns of Judah, each on their own property in the various towns, whilst others from both Judah and Benjamin lived in Jerusalem. And then it goes on and describes all the lists of names as to who was living where. And so this chapter, it's an interesting one. It speaks of the redistribution of people so that some would move to Jerusalem, some would stay in their own towns, which presumably were outside of the main city. And so, Dr. John, why is something like this necessary? As we read through, this might seem like a bit of a strange inclusion into the scriptures. So what's really going on here?
Well, Jerusalem was really the spiritual centre of Jewish worship. The temple was there, the priests were carrying out the sacrifices, the worship of God. So it was a political and spiritual centre of worship. So it had enormous spiritual significance for the Jewish people. And so those who decided to reside there, they were commended. They made a good choice, commended for that. However, it was important that other people went to live in the rest of the country.
Yeah.
Now, in Exodus chapter 12, God had given the Israelites the promised land. But it was a promised land. It wasn't just a promised city. There's the whole land there.
Right.
And this land was flowing with milk and honey. We read in Deuteronomy 27. So it really made sense to make the most of the whole of the land and the rich resources that God had provided for his people.
That's really helpful, just bringing us into understanding those verses a little bit. And I mean, Amy, as we look at who lived in Jerusalem, we can see the leaders lived in Jerusalem. Some were chosen almost by lottery, in a sense, 1 in 10. And then there were those who volunteered and they were commended. What is behind that commendation?
Well, these people, they, as you said, they volunteered, they willingly chose to move to Jerusalem. And I think if we look at the context of this, ultimately, people have laid down their roots outside of the city. They've gotten used to living there. And actually, for some, this is a really big change. They've grown up in a rural landscape, spacious, and then they're going to be, moving into an urban community, restricted pattern of life. It's a little bit more confined. And so there's a big difference in terms of that. But then also in terms of, if you're leaving your home, you're leaving your wider family, your friends, your neighbors, work, everything that you know into a radically different environment. So you've got that sort of aspect of it as well. But furthermore, as well, if you look at the history as well, so we've noted that Jerusalem became a bit of a ghost town, after the Babylonian Empire came and took over. It was left as a ghost town, and when they started to rebuild the walls, we've seen in previous chapters, there's a lot of opposition, and so it's not out of the blue to think that there would be another attack. And so I think there's also this slight fear around the unknown of actually, is there going to be more conflict? And so there's sort of a bit of a risk in moving there as well. So I think there's several factors when people are commending those people for volunteering.
It's really interesting, isn't it? You say, because even whilst the Israelites were rebuilding the walls, we noticed that they were under attack from those surrounding peoples, don't we? And so there is a sense of those who were volunteering in particular, that shows a sense of a courageous spirit. And dare I say, a bit of a pioneer spirit in a sense as well, because they really were, they've rebuilt the walls, but okay, they're They're still rebuilding the social structure, the religious goings on. This is a city which, it needs to be rebuilt now from the inside, doesn't it? So, Laulu, anything just to add about those who volunteered there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as already mentioned, they had quite literally a pioneer spirit. I mean, when you think about it, they had to live, they had to leave rather their social norms. They used to live, with a certain view of material things. They used to have, their work already set and cut out. But actually moving, to this place in Jerusalem, actually with it also only being 1 in 10, it actually put a whole new perspective on things, because the people around you are going to be different. The entire social norms are going to be different, and actually it was a huge adjustment. And also, when you think about it, they built these walls around the city because they knew that people would want to attack. So actually, these people who stayed as well, they chose to stand strong and actually be part of the people to protect this city as well. So actually, we look at this and we see how notable it is for these people, first of all, to choose to do this. But actually, I want to point out, because the leaders themselves as well, it was really commendable for them to step up, because actually, how often do we see people are afraid to take a step, and actually the leaders, don't, take the first step for people to follow along as well. But actually, for the leaders of the people to set that example by saying, we are all going to live in Jerusalem, I think that, put a bit of a really good spirit in the others as well, to be like, okay, it's time for us to actually, take this step as well. So actually, I think the people really deserved a lot of commendation, but then also the leaders as well, because they all chose to settle in Jerusalem.
There's a lot of lessons which translate into today's, world, as we live as people of faith and people who want to see God's, kingdom built up as Christians. There's some lessons that we can take from this, isn't there? It is interesting that it's, those who voluntarily, stepped up, they were commended, amongst the people. And, in today's world, we don't have a literal city to see built up, but we want to see the church built up. We want to see the kingdom expanded. And so I almost read that and I think, okay, it's a commendable thing for there to be a sense of a volunteer culture in God's kingdom. Dr. John, just obviously the leaders, as Laulu brought in, they did choose to settle in Jerusalem. Anything just to add on there as to what may have led to that decision?
Jerusalem is described as the holy city. It's such significance, really. It's called Zion, city of God. It's written about in the Psalms. Psalm 87, glorious things are spoken. God is present everywhere, but his symbolic presence was in Jerusalem in the temple. Zion, Jerusalem, is called God's holy mountain. The chosen king on the throne in Jerusalem. And from Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth. That's Psalm 50. And so Jerusalem has great significance as being symbolically where God is present and God is worshipped.
That's really helpful. And so it almost makes sense for that almost to be the central almost base for God's people. As you've mentioned, obviously the promised land not limited there, but for that to be almost the center of operations in a sense. Yeah,
it's good as well, isn't it? Because I think the leaders, because they were the first people to, as we see in verse 1, they were the first people to dwell in Jerusalem. I think that's so important, isn't it? Because leaders can't expect other people to do something that they're not willing to do themselves. Leaders set the pattern with their lives. And I think that's such an important thing to note here. And as Dr. John said as well, the leaders would have understood the significance of Jerusalem. But I just love the fact that actually they weren't going to wait for somebody else to step up. No, they were going to set the example.
That's really good. And I mean, there's certainly lessons for godly leadership that we can all take from this, isn't there? And I mean, throughout the whole book of Nehemiah, studying Nehemiah as a character and how he operates, there's a whole lot of lessons that we can take in terms of how to operate in godly leadership, for sure. Another interesting detail just to pick up on in verse 4, it mentions Judah and Benjamin, two of the tribes of Israel. And so interesting that they're the only two mentioned there, Dr. John. Where are the other tribes? What's going on there?
I think really to understand the significance of the specific tribes of Israel, we need to just look a little bit in the history of the Jewish nation. Going back to Abram, who was Isaac's father, and Isaac was Jacob's father. And Jacob had 12 sons. We can read about those in Genesis chapter 35. And each of the 12 tribes of Israel had the name of one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Now, going a bit further on to the time of Solomon, Solomon turned away from God. His wives, pagan wives, drew him away from God. And God brought judgment on Solomon. Now, the two sons that are listed here, we want to consider, are Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And God took most of the kingdom away from Rehoboam, 10 tribes, and gave them to the son Jeroboam. So Rehoboam ruled in Jerusalem, and he had 2 tribes, which were Benjamin and Judah. So those 2 tribes were in the province of Judah, which is in the south of the country. Rehoboam was king over that southern kingdom, but Jeroboam was up in the north, and he had 10 of the 12 tribes there. And so that's why it's talking here about Judah and Benjamin, because they're in Judah, which is what the whole story is about, and Jerusalem is the capital of Judah.
That's really helpful, Dr. John. So if people want to read more about that, I believe it's the beginning of 1 Kings.
1 Kings, yes, particularly chapter 11. And it's interesting because the Israel in the north, they were taken into captivity by the Assyrians, whereas Judah in the south were taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Ultimately, in Jewish history, the 2 kingdoms come together as a united kingdom.
Brilliant. That's really, really helpful. And I know that some scholars even suggest there's interesting things about the ways that those 2 were taken into exile separately. Some suggest even with the first 10 tribes going into exile earlier on, that there was less of them who returned because they were in exile for longer. Obviously, there's a bit of speculation going on there, but it's certainly interesting to read. And the reason we go into these details is because then it's like, it helps when we're reading any text in the Bible to understand what is the context behind this, so that then when we're reading through, we can say, I understand why they're naming these specific tribes there. Okay, and Amy, this chapter as a whole, it's quite fascinating in the sense of the levels of detail it goes into, naming the specific people who lived in Jerusalem, broken down by Levites, gatekeepers, priests, etc. And then those, who lived in villages. It's quite a huge amount of detail there. So the question is, why does the Bible go into that? And then does that lend any sense of credibility to the Bible? Or, specifically we're looking at Nehemiah here as a book.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think in the whole book of Nehemiah, we see 5 different sort of lists, 5 different sort of historic accounts. And this does really, contribute to the credibility of the Bible. We get these historic accounts, these lists, and you can compare them to other historic accounts outside of the Bible, and you can sort of compare them and see the accuracy of that, which is just incredible. But also, if we look at the history itself, this was immensely important to God's people. Not only did it provide them with a reliable record so that they could trace back to their roots, but it was much more than that. It wasn't just a list of irrelevant or random names, but, these archives conveyed, a series of biblical truths. And it's interesting as well because each name represents a story of God's goodness, a story of God's faithfulness. And I think, we really get these historic accounts. I think it's important for us to read them as such. I think a lot of people, when we read the Bible, it's very easy to sort of fall into, I guess, the habit of trying to read things devotionally, but not all of the books in the Bible are meant to be read devotionally. If you look at the book of Leviticus and all the sacrifices, it's not really a devotional book, but it's more, we're gleaming knowledge from that of what they did at the time. It's like a historic account, and it helps us to understand, the holiness of God more. And so I think these historic accounts help us to understand our history. It helps us to understand the character of God. And so I think then, therefore, we need to read these accounts as such. You know, we can still learn and glean things from these passages, but we just have to approach it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, you mentioned how each name listed there represents a life, it represents a person. And I find that almost humbling in a sense that, you know, you read through, you know, verse 4, from the descendants of Judah, Athaiah, son of Uzziah, one of the people who lived in Jerusalem. You know, probably most people don't know that name as a household name today. But that is somebody whose name has gone down in the history, in the Bible, and they played a part, in a sense, of God's people being rebuilt, which ultimately continued the line, which led through to Jesus and led through to everything that has followed since. To me, that speaks almost of each of those people living for a cause that's bigger than themselves. You know, it's almost, okay, you know, people might not remember our names as such, but the impact of just what we do, just playing our part, just doing our bit, it will echo down throughout eternity. But I do just want to come back to what you're saying there about the type of book that Nehemiah is, and the Bible that is. You know, it's been said that the Bible, it wasn't written to us, but it was written for us in a sense. And so it can be a helpful realization to have with that. And so, Dr. John, let's just, just study that a little bit more. For people who are reading the book of Nehemiah for themselves at home, what type of writing is this? Because it's fair to say there's different types of writing in the book, isn't there? You know, Nehemiah is very different to the Psalms, for example.
Yes. It's interesting because the Bible has many different styles of writing. We've mentioned some of those. Historical accounts, poetry, philosophy, theological discussions, genealogy. Well, certainly in Nehemiah we get the historical accounts. We have some genealogies, there's some names. Theology, there are some principles there. There is the principles there, repentance and turning to God, making a commitment to God. So I think it's important to know all of the Bible is the inspired word of God,
right?
But it's written for different purposes. So say, for example, if I was going to a poetry club, I wouldn't come along with my family tree. You'd think, no, but I won't say, well, family trees, throw it in the bin. It's what it's written for. It's interesting because the Apostle John, about his gospel, his writings, about the words and deeds of Jesus, he said, these are written, the purpose, right? These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And that by believing you may have life in his name. So certainly John and the Gospels, they were historical accounts, certainly. They brought in some of the teaching, obviously, but they were written for a purpose, that we may believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So if you're looking for theological discussions, try Paul's letters. Even Peter had difficulty with Paul's letters. But there's a lot of principles there. Guidance for living, Proverbs. Encouragement in life, the Psalms, historical accounts as well as Nehemiah, Chronicles, Kings. And so there's just some examples there. But all those, I think what is amazing, it all comes together in a coherent, logical form, written by so many different people, different types of people over many, many centuries, different styles of writing. But it's all God's words, it's all inspired by God. And it's all there to inform us, to instruct us, to teach us, and we can learn from that.
It's really, really helpful, Dr. John, and I think that is so helpful, isn't it? Because you think about how the type of writing it impacts totally in how we read it. You kind of think, if I was to say my bones are wasting away, okay, if that was written on a doctor's chart, it would mean something very different to how if I was just in conversation with my wife saying I was a bit tired. They kind of mean different things, don't they? But, to bring this back to the book of Nehemiah, this is written as you said, it's history. And so almost, we should be, the fact that it lists all these names, that kind of tells us that. And so the stories that it talks about, they're to be read by us today as things that really happened. But I find it interesting as well because I think we brought out in the first chapter that this is written, of course, firsthand by Nehemiah. It's Nehemiah who is telling this story. And he is, of course, one of the key figures in the story. And so it's almost a helpful little thing to think as we're reading through the book of Nehemiah, okay, these are things that happen, but what would it have been like to be in Nehemiah's shoes here? Because all of this stuff, we're kind of reading it from his perspective. So that can be a bit of a helpful question that we can ask when reading through the book of Nehemiah. Wonderful. Anything to add?
No, I think you've really summarized that really well. I think as Dr. John said, there's lots of different forms of writing. And I think even in Nehemiah itself, as we've mentioned, there's the historic accounts, there's the sort of first person writing as well, the reports. It's really interesting that such a short book has got so many different forms of writing. Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting book for us to read. It's really interesting in terms of everything that we get out of it. We get the history, we get a bit of a synopsis of what's happened previously in the Bible. You know, we learn about leadership. There's so much that we can glean from this book, and I think it's such a helpful book for us to really lean into. Absolutely. A really good one for you to study for yourself today. That's Nehemiah chapter 11. We'll see you next time.